This is your host of CivilNet, Eric Hacopian, and we're honored to have as our guest today Sossy Tatikyan, who's an expert on international relations and security. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting.
There's a lot of conversation now about, or a push, depending on coming from different people, for the recognition of Artsakh. But I don't know if people know exactly what that means. What are the legal mechanisms that we're discussing? What are the political implications that we're discussing? And what are the moral, the humanitarian implications that we're discussing? What does that particularly entail?
Thank you very much. Indeed, recognition sounds kind of vague, so I'll try to explain it a little. As you know, there are two principles in international law, self-determination and territorial integrity. But that's not the only principles in international law. That's just like two of the few fundamental principles. However, international law is developing, and developing very rapidly since the 90s of the last century. And it's exactly the time when Nagorno Karabakh or Artsakh conflict started. Since then, former Yugoslavia collapsed and several new states were recognized, and one of them, Kosovo, is semi-recognized, as you know. And it wasn't just ex-Yugoslavia, it was South Sudan in 2011, and earlier East Timor or Timor-Leste in 2002. Mm-hmm. So for the recognition of all those entities, a very interesting new notion was raised, which is not actually something coming from any UN convention or documents, but it was rather a basis for bilateral recognition by various states. And it's called remedial recognition of secession. So this was the notion to which, let's say, US official Bolton has referred to, talking about Kosovo's recognition. But even without referring to it, even Bangladesh was recognized based on that notion, basically.
1971, yeah.
Yes. So we can even go earlier in the history. So what does it mean? Actually, it's based on another new principle in international law, which is already a very UN notion. It's called responsibility to protect. To protect whom? To protect civilians. So there was a UN summit in 2005, and the notion of responsibility to protect became official in the UN terminology, and over the last several decades, years, and even decades, at least 2-3 decades, many UN peacekeeping missions have been established based on the responsibility to protect civilians, not necessarily for inter-ethnic conflicts, but there were other situations like civil wars in Africa, for instance. Mm-hmm. Okay, now let's return to more similar cases, to Artsakh. So in case, basically, remedial secession means that the state entity cannot really survive within the so-called parent state. Mm-hmm. For instance, Kosovo within ex-Yugoslavia or Serbia, or East Timor was basically annexed, occupied by Indonesia. And there were attempts for ethnic cleansing mm-hmm. in all those cases, the same in South Sudan. Mm-hmm. That's why international community realized that if they leave the state entity within that state, it creates existential threat for its people. So it's not even about territory. Currently, international community doesn't even care much about history, because, for instance, if you talk about historical and legal background of Kosovo, it's very complicated. Serbs will prove to you that mm-hmm. Kosovo was historically Serbian. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that there were massacres, there were attempts for ethnic cleansing, and there were war crimes, by the way, by both sides, but Kosovo population was subjected to the existential threat. And that's why Europe, most of the European Union states, US, and later on many other states in other continents recognized Kosovo bilaterally after it declared its independence unilaterally in 2008. With Timor, after 30 years of occupation by Indonesia and massacres, serious massacres, international community again recognized the independence of East Timor. Now, recognition is not happening by the UN Security Council. No, it doesn't happen that way. It happens bilaterally. And later on, the state entity can apply to the UN Security Council, and based on the recommendation of UN Security Council states, it goes to the General Assembly and the majority should approve it.
Thank you for that unraveling that difficult question. We hear a lot about, from a very technical standpoint, according to Azerbaijan, the residents of Artsakh are citizens of Azerbaijan from their legal perspective. It's not something anybody here would recognize or anybody in Artsakh would obviously recognize. But my question for you is, I don't know, we have seen that, moral issues have very little to do with this current conflict as far as how the world looks at it. But does a state that claims a group of people of a different ethnicity as its citizens, but drops cluster bombs on those people, targets their hospitals, and specifically targets their cultural institutions, we know that they have lost the moral right to rule the people of Artsakh. But is there any place where this moral right, their loss of moral right, moves into a loss of legal right once you take actions like that?
I believe so. First of all, territorial integrity notion in case of Nagorno Karabakh is very questionable in general, because Armenian side documents very well that Artsakh had all the right to secede from the Soviet Azerbaijan after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was one of the articles of the Soviet Constitution that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, its autonomous regions and republics have a right to declare independence. Okay? So, secondly, as we know, Artsakh has never been historically Azerbaijan or part of independent Azerbaijan. It was given to Azerbaijan overnight based on the decision coming from Stalin. And Stalin's policy was very clear: divide in order to keep control. So the whole notion of territorial integrity can be questioned in general. However, let's assume that, okay, fine, Artsakh people are citizens of Azerbaijan, but according to the UN and according to this responsibility to protect notion, every state is responsible for the life and rights of its own population. So Azerbaijan is violating international law, UN Charter, because UN Charter doesn't allow to use force. UN Charter doesn't allow resolution of conflicts through military means, through war, military aggression. So Azerbaijan has started military aggression, and it's very easy to prove, because I don't think that Armenians are kamikazes. 140,000 Armenians in Artsakh and 9 million Armenians in Artsakh could not really start a war against 10 million Azerbaijan and 83 million Turkey, which is the second largest army in the NATO, plus thousands of jihadists coming from Middle East, Syria, and potentially elsewhere. So, of course, it's obvious that Armenia had zero interest to start this war, so it's Azerbaijan that has started large-scale military aggression, and it's using ballistic missiles,
cluster bombs, ballistic missiles and drones against a civilian population that is located so far away from any military infrastructure and from armed forces. People in Stepanakert and Shushi and other residential areas. Second, cluster bombs. So in 2008, a new convention on the prohibition of cluster bombs was adopted and signed.
neither Armenia nor Azerbaijan have signed it, because Armenia has stated that will sign it when Azerbaijan signs it. However, Armenia, as far as we know, doesn't have cluster munitions. So it's only Azerbaijan that is using it. And cluster bombs, even if a state hasn't signed this convention, it is still obliged not to violate it, because it's part of the international customary law not to use armaments that cause indiscriminate human suffering. Because with cluster munitions, they just break down into pieces, and they potentially harm civilians for many years to come. So Azerbaijan has no moral right to use cluster munitions, and even if it's their citizens that they claim, it doesn't have right to do so even more.
In the past, this issue of recognition has been seen as, well, you're going to conflict with a settlement of a peaceful settlement of this dispute, because if you already recognize Artsakh as an independent entity, what do the Azeris have to bargain over? And it's best, this final recognition is best left to the negotiation process. But given the situation that we're in right now, doesn't recognition actually help bring about a peace process if Azerbaijan understands that Karabakh proper is going to be independent and is never going to be back under their supervision? If they recognize that, isn't that gonna prompt a negotiation in which, from their perspective, let's at least get things back that are not the areas around Karabakh, that are not in Karabakh proper? Doesn't that take something that's most problematic off the table and essentially force both sides to a peace deal?
I genuinely hope so. I think that before, perhaps Armenia and some of the international community were aiming to keep the status quo, because it's obvious that Azerbaijan has more budget, more population, more armaments, and it was a way to prevent a new war. But it failed, okay? It cannot be worse than this. Azerbaijan is attacking Artsakh and even some regions of Armenia with large-scale military operations, with most sophisticated weapons received from all kinds of states, belonging to all kinds of political and military alliances, starting from collective security treaty, ending with NATO, as well as Israel. So right now it's obvious that status quo is not sustainable. Something needs to be done, and the international community is responsible, because you know, I've worked in the UN, OSCE for many years, and I've dealt with NATO, EU, African Union, and I've been hearing for years that the international community was not robust enough to prevent genocides, let's say in Srebrenica in Bosnia, or in Rwanda. And there is also a lot of criticism about other places in the world, like ISIS, Yazidis. Okay, fine. Now, this is happening now. It's happening in European neighborhood. How can international community allow this to happen and just to watch and make just politically correct, balanced statements, putting a sign of equality between the perpetrator, the aggressor, and a nation that is basically struggling for its self-defense and existential threat? So I think that the international community has a responsibility to stop this war and find a kind of a resolution. It's obvious that OSCE Minsk group negotiations haven't resulted in any peace deal, peace agreement, because Azerbaijan is not signing any agreement, and it presents maximalist and militaristic requirements, and it basically is not ready for any concession. It just wants Armenians to give up everything, and it cannot continue like this. And by the way, there is a very important element here. So right now, international humanitarian organizations don't go to Artsakh to record the war crimes. For instance, killing of the civilian population, including mutilation. As we know, it has happened in a lot of cases in 2016, decapitation and now mutilation of bodies of civilian people because of the unrecognized status of Artsakh. This doesn't look good, okay?
I think I'm very glad you, first of all, touched on this false moral equivalency, because I think it's intellectual, frankly, imbecilism. And I think everyone is so frustrated with these headlines, skirmishes erupt like it's a volcano. And I'm glad you touched on that. And I'm also, I want to double up on what you said, that there's this notion that both sides couldn't agree on a peace deal. Actually, in two instances, both in 2001, in the case of Robert Kocharyan in Key West, and in Kazan in 2011, the Armenian side pretty much accepted what is the equivalent of the Madrid Protocols, even though that's not necessarily particularly popular in Armenia.
Yes.
And the holdup, the two times, what has prevented a peace deal is Azerbaijan's refusal to face reality that Artsakh is an independent state and it will never be under their autonomy ever again. That is, there's only one party here that has said no to peace. This is not two sides didn't reach agreement. I think we need to make clear with that. I want to close up with this. Obviously, it takes diplomatic work and muscle to bring about recognition. You need to work at it. And frankly, this isn't new. I remember in the 91-92 period, Rafi Ovanesyan, when he was the foreign minister, going to different places in South America, Uruguay, Argentina, to sort of trigger a recognition process of Artsakh. What do you think it's going to take, given the isolation of this country at this point, to bring about, create pressure in different places to recognize Artsakh? And I was also intrigued by what's going on in France, because there's parliamentary motions to do so. But as far as I know, in almost every state, it's an executive decision. It's not a parliamentary decision. Maybe I'm wrong. But I want you to talk about how would you're the foreign minister for a day. What's your plan to push for recognition? Where do you go? What are the most likely prospects? What do you do?
That's not easy. First of all, as you started your first question, recognition of what? Because in our case, unlike Kosovo and East Timor, Artsakh has been de facto separate from Azerbaijan for many years. It has conducted several rounds of elections. It has established on its own its self-government bodies, president, government, parliament, even armed forces. So it's not in the same state as Kosovo or East Timor, when international community basically acted. UN acted as territorial administration, helping the local authorities to establish those bodies, and at the same time acting as those bodies for a number of years. So Artsakh has a more advanced state. There is a Montevideo Convention, and it lists several attributes to which a state entity should correspond, and Artsakh has met most of those requirements. But now, more relevant to your question, so it's not easy, because, as I said, UN Security Council has no authority to recognize an independence or some other status for a state entity, so it's done bilaterally. And I would first of all start from Europe, because we are in European neighborhood, and European Union has been always very vocal about human rights and good governance and democracy, etc. So this is an obvious situation when we really look at Europe, and we hope to receive their support. And we believe that Europe has a moral obligation to do so. By the way, EU can also establish a mission. I've worked in a number of countries in the same Kosovo or Central African Republic, where EU has established various missions, and it has missions in Moldova and Georgia and Ukraine under the umbrella of European Union Security and Defense Policy Framework. So, as we know, OSCE ceasefire monitoring mission has not been established because of the veto of Azerbaijan and potentially also Turkey, because in OSCE, any member state can veto the establishment of any mission or any decision. To me, it looks like OSCE Minsk Group co-chairs, Russia, EU and US should act jointly and establish this ceasefire monitoring mission, because even if it's so obvious who has violated ceasefire so many times, there is a need for a mission to record this, to monitor it for the years to come. So in case of France, as we know, France is in a difficult position right now because it is an OSCE Minsk Group co-chairman, so it should be impartial. But impartial doesn't mean neutral. Huh? Impartial and neutral are two different things. Neutral means that you don't react to violations of international law. Impartial means that you are not biased to any of the sides. So you can be impartial, but not neutral. So huge difference here. So as to the question where the decisions coming from legislature affect those of executive, it depends. It really varies from one country to another. For instance, I'm told that in Netherlands, any motion adopted in the parliament has a very serious influence on the executive. So I think what Armenia should do, it should work with, first of all, of course, with OSCE Minsk Group countries, and apparently there are signs of more active engagement also by the US over the last 2 days, which we didn't see earlier. But also not limited to Minsk Group, because Minsk Group, we have Azerbaijan and Turkey there, so it has become very complicated. So Armenia should work bilaterally with states, with Europe, and not only with Europe, with Middle East. Why not? Middle East has very complicated relations with Turkey. It realizes that Turkey is creating a lot of turbulence in various regions of the world. And as you mentioned, yes, Latin America, basically we should work with all partners around the world.
Mrs. Tatikyan, I want to thank you for joining us and your expertise and enlightening us on these issues.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is your host of CivilNet, Hacopian, and thank you for joining us.